Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad you decided to come to this session. We have about 45 minutes, and during that time, I hope that if you have some thoughts, some ideas, some questions, you won't hesitate. I think the folks in the room can contribute a lot more than just one person can to this discussion about how do we drive enhanced enterprise security, both from internal actions within an organization, perhaps actions within the sector, and nationally, and that becomes important as we look at a lot of the pressure on Capitol Hill to try to drive progress with a view of some, if not many, and certainly some at DHS, that there has been a market failure. We've not adequately have the technologies and processes in place to manage the risk to our nation, to our critical infrastructure, to our major companies to an adequate degree. Nothing more terrible than activity without insight, and we have certainly seen an awful lot of activity. As we try to think about the challenges we face within companies, and we work in support of CSE and trying to help advance our internal risk management, as well as trying to grow our cyber business in the public and private sector. And so you can certainly see the challenge and sometimes the opportunity to convince the powers that be of a publicly traded company. We need to do X, Y, and Z. We need a roadmap. We need to invest money over time and identify them and meet those challenges. The kinds of accountability that organizations need that now that I'm working full-time for a publicly traded company, a greater appreciation of what it means to have to deal with annual results, with quarterly results, with the issue of how much is the company going to invest to build capabilities and grow a business. It's something now that I have a much greater appreciation than I did before. As we talk about trying to drive enterprise security, does anyone have a question you want to make sure we cover? I was going to just list a few of the questions if people have them, and then we can make sure as we go through that we cover them. Anybody have a question or a point we want to make sure that we find time to make during the course of this now about 40 minutes? So one thing that's going to be the case is when this is over, you're not going to be able to say you didn't have a chance to ask a question or make your point. Yes?
Well,
and by the way, we did have more time to go into more detail about our bio, and I wish he would have stayed and continued. But
yeah, maybe Tim Sullivan, Fidelis. I'm sort of interested because I see cybersecurity as a process of threat and countermeasure, causing evolved threat, causing evolved countermeasure. And how do you see large corporations like CSC staying at the edge of the threat, staying where the threat is at? What sort of organizational processes do you guys have in place to be where the threat's at?
we will definitely cover that point, and if I don't, you'll remind me. And by the way, if anybody has a particularly difficult question, I will run out of time. I won't be able to get to it. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. David Simpson, the CSFI. I had a question or something I'd like to touch on, which is what marketing collaborations does CSC work through to identify their strategic opportunities for advancement for the future and for your lines of business?
Okay. Yes.
Bill Jackson, NRC. I was wondering what metrics or criteria you use to balance the needs of the user versus needs of securing an operational environment.
Okay. Somebody? Yes.
Carl Sandberg. And I'm interested in learning a little bit more about different frameworks for measuring return on investment from a corporate standpoint, and maybe gearing that to different audiences, either through to the stockholder, through to the internal management team, and to interested stakeholders such as bank financiers and so forth.
That is definitely one of the toughest. In fact, I was in a meeting earlier today where that was one of the issues that came up. Yes.
Adam Berlin, Triumphant. I'm curious how CSC thinks about sort of risk metrics as it relates to cybersecurity.
The threat matrix?
Risk metrics.
Okay. Yes.
Wondering, as a shareholder and a manager in a public company, how much security is too much appropriate for your enterprise?
Okay. Somebody else have a hand up and put it down? Your question's already been listed. The other thing I wanted to ask up front is, does anybody have a vignette or a case study you want to, sometime during the next 40 minutes, briefly talk about as to how you've met the challenge and convinced your organization to make the kinds of investment or create the kinds of metrics or ability to track where you stand. I would really welcome hearing any of those case studies, and I'd be happy to share with everybody your name and contact information in case they want to follow up with you, with you later for more detail about that.
Along those lines, you may want to share what that right level of investment is.
Right level of what?
Right level of investment is. You said that, what is the right level of investment in your opinion that gives people or organizations where they need to be?
Well, one comment is that the right level of investment is based upon what is the risk framework of that organization and what is their current security posture. You have to know what the security posture is before you begin the process of a process remediation event. But we do happen to have a case study that does speak to one of the ways that we have vet that in the industry.
Okay. Other questions, or feel free to comment if you want to. Otherwise, feel free to comment as we proceed through it. Anybody else? Well, that's a great list, and we definitely will run out of time and not be able to address each and every one of them, but we will do our best. Some of the major trends, obviously, we're very dependent on IT, and it's growing more so every day. More sophisticated threats, and frankly, I think some of the less sophisticated threats still can cause havoc for many major companies. Increased regulation and compliance, and the roadmap on Capitol Hill suggests that there may be increased regulation and compliance. We can talk about some possible alternatives to that framework that could drive progress more quickly. But as you know, broadband is increasing. Internet is going to be 4 times larger in 2014 than it was in 2009. Mobile traffic's doubling every year. I had a meeting earlier this week with somebody with a really large company, and they actually do compete with us a little bit. And the position of this person was that mobile is a fad. I know some CEOs who said they would never have a computer on their desk. And others more recently have said they will never put any critical information in the cloud. You can kind of track how we're going to do on those. Video on demand is doubling. It would take over 2 years to watch the amount of video that would cross global IP networks every second in 2014. So the challenge of seeing what we need to worry about, reacting in time to protect yourself, becomes a great challenge. I think we have what I consider, it is a little bit of a high level, one of the best and most important documents I've ever seen in cyber was released by Phil Reitinger at DHS in late March, the Cyber Ecosystem paper, which really lays out a framework. It builds on the kind of the subcontext of the NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and creates a vision that I think is consistent with our concern about security, our concern about civil liberties, our concern about trying to make sure government isn't controlling everything. So I encourage you, and if you need a link, I'll post my email address later, send you a link to that DHS document. But it's very, very exciting in my view. What's necessary, major trends, gap between threats and capabilities. I'm going through some of this quicker because obviously you all have a lot to say and I want to make sure we can get to it. The SecurityStat concept, which is our strategic approach that we're recommending. It's not a product, we don't sell it, it's not a consulting service. But we believe it paints the picture of how an organization has to work with other organizations in the government to manage the risk in a way that's appropriate to the mission and the criticalities that face that particular organization. Because the point made earlier about risk management is absolutely critical in my view. Situational awareness, which is fundamental to the congressional landscape. The big debate is incentives versus regulation. And the question is, how do you drive action? One of the fundamental things that I think has been missing from the private sector perspective is, if you want to say you want to do incentives, there are 2 fundamental things that I believe have to be said. One is, what is it you want companies to do? And what is the incentive that you have to give them to get them to do it? In my view, neither of those 2 questions has been answered in any of the public dialogue that I've seen. Innovation and due diligence. I think we are fundamentally missing the criticality of innovation and an innovation initiative, not just R&D, but trying to find those new, great, exciting technologies. I'm talking about companies that aren't even as far along as Fidelis, but have those kinds of exciting capabilities to bring to bear at the national, the sectoral, and even individual organizations to give yourself visibility into what's possible. How can you do what you need to do? Because fundamentally, is not about cybersecurity. It's not about information technology. It's about how do we advance the mission of our organizations. It's fundamentally what it's all about. We have to help advance the mission. So when you talk about ROI, the stovepipe view of cybersecurity or even IT, how does it fit into advancing the mission? And the processes and the activities of cybersecurity, if we can tie them more directly to mission. I worked with the Software Engineering Institute of Carnegie Mellon for a while. If there had been more time, you could perhaps mention it. But they developed a resiliency engineering framework. So the idea is you get stakeholders from across your organization, and then what they do is they help promote innovation with the idea that they're trying to drive the mission and effectiveness of the organization. So trying to use technology to advance mission, trying to make sure you are cognizant and build in security consistent with a risk management framework, making sure you cover your business continuity and disaster recovery mechanisms, and that you have exercises to track what you're doing. So you have a process improvement model for advancing mission that also helps you more effectively manage and measure risk. What do we need to worry about? What do we need to do about it? When I was at DHS, we organized the first cyberstorm, national cyber exercise, back in 2006. People don't talk a lot about the one that we did in 2004, Livewire, when we were first standing up the National Cybersecurity Division. But we had a tremendous process, and there have been 2 more cyberstorms since then, where government and private sector working together, testing the processes, communication mechanisms for government and the private sector collaboratively and as organizations to respond to major incidents, to detect, to analyze, to respond, and potentially to recover. So coming out of Cyberstorm 1, using the defense model of exercises, and everybody is very collaborative, and you identify what the gaps are and what needs to happen. We created a process, again, building on the defense model, for fundamentally, what do we need to worry about, what do we need to do about it? Setting a path forward. Our system, our structure, is really not set up yet to do that effectively in an area like cybersecurity. So, for example, when I testified on the Hill, I'd be asked questions like, is the President's budget for cyber R&D adequate? Or is the President's budget for cybersecurity adequate? Questions I was asked by 2 different committee chairmen. And I gave the only acceptable answer that you can give if you want a chance to testify again. Although I gave it in a slightly different way, and of course they didn't listen. I said the President's budget is adequate on both those very important issues to do the things we plan to do in that fiscal year. Which of course is a circular non-answer. Because you can't, when you're in the context of government, at least you can't so far, articulate what you really need to do. You have to go through the budget process. So Cyberstorm 1 created a tremendous set of things that we had to do. Things that DHS needed to do, things the interagency process needed to do, things the private sector and the ISACs needed to do. There was even a piece on the international community, what needed to happen. So one of the lessons coming out of Cyberstorm, it wasn't classified so I can talk about it, was we need to build cyber into what's called the Common Operating Picture of the NOC, the National Operations Center at DHS. When you go in there, it's a TSSCI cleared facility, and it's really remarkable as it pulls together all the pieces of data, state and local, federal, intel, military, all that stuff is right there. And so each morning we have a classified session where people will talk about what happened overnight. Somebody went across the border in Canada, somebody was in the car next to them, and the person next to them in the car was tied into so-and-so. Really trying to make it easy to connect the dots with a kind of a low technology thing. So cyber was not part of that picture. So they have all the great screens, they're probably bigger and flatter now than they were then. And you have all the incidents and natural disasters and all that stuff is reflected. Well, one of the recommendations was to build cyber into the Common Operating Picture at the National Operations Center. So I went to the private sector and we're part of the public-private partnership planning for Cyberstorm 2. So I said, oh, okay, well, why don't we ask DHS to brief us on the after-action report from Cyberstorm 1? What's been completed, what's in process, and what hasn't been started. Well, they didn't want to do it. They wanted to plan for Cyberstorm 2, and we spent about $3.5 million on Cyberstorm 1. They were spending about $6.5 million on Cyberstorm 2, and you really do want a good exercise, and you really do want to have, and I course, enjoyed participating in the press conference with the Undersecretary after Cyberstorm 1, where we talked about the greatest cyber exercise ever and everything's great. And so we, of course, didn't do that briefing. And so after Cyberstorm 2, I went to the head of cyber at DHS, private conversation about it. And I said, well, what happened to the after action for Cyberstorm 1? Specifically, one example. Why haven't we built cyber into the common operating picture of the NOC? And I was told, well, we have a lot of after action, we got a lot of taskings, we have a lot of requests, we got meetings, we got a lot of stuff we got to do, which is all true and it's not any fun. You know, the glory may not be what it really seems like. And, but the fundamental thing, which to me is critical for organizations and for the nation in terms of cyber, nobody ever asked. You have this wonderful after action, nobody ever looks again. Okay? Nobody holds anybody accountable, which is why some of the stuff in the draft legislation is saying you need this plan for cyber. And to me, a plan is goals, objectives, milestones. So you can say where you're going, what are the resources you need, who's got to collaborate, who's accountable, and then you can track progress. So when I took over heading National Cybersecurity Division U.S. CERT, we created a plan for cyber. You, of course, haven't seen it because it had goals, objectives, and milestones. So when I ran it through the hierarchy of DHS, I was told, no, we can't release this because it'll be too easy to tell if we fail. Which was precisely the reason we wanted to do it. We want to make it easy to fail. Because if you can't measure success, you can't drive success, how do you really have progress? I would suggest we may not have had quite as much progress in the last 4 or 5 years as we would have if we had those kinds of goals and milestones and objectives. And similarly, within an organization, fundamentally understanding the risk management and the assessment, and making sure high-level folks know so that they can decide to accept, mitigate, transfer, I'm sure I'm missing one of them, the risk. So they have visibility, they have to sign on so it becomes part of their bailiwick. Because when we look at the potential for a disaster, whether natural or man-made, affecting cyber or really anything else, and we hear those people, some of the minds we work with, who talk about the fear of a digital Pearl Harbor, thinking that until something really bad happens, we're really not going to do anything about it. And fundamentally, we do not as a nation, I think, we can't really conclude that if something really bad happens, that we will really do something about it. We can conclude that somebody's going to get blamed. And so the idea within an organization and nationally to identify what do we need to worry about, what do we need to do about it, so you can measure progress so that somebody is bought into it. And on the bright side, it's that they want to share, and they can help drive, and they can help resource, and they can support the process. On the negative side, they realize that they will share the blame, because there will be a very clear trail as to they were told what they need to worry about. You don't need to be an expert to be held accountable for those things that you were told about. We need to know our risk posture. We have to identify requirements, and at the national and sectoral level, public-private collaboration within the organization, hopefully key stakeholders across the organization. Make it easy to hold folks accountable. A holistic view of the enterprise and of the risk and all the pieces of it. Strategic choices drive the policies implemented to make the organization successful. The policies implemented dictate the technology to accomplish the strategy. The results of the technology implementation influence the next round. So it's not about cybersecurity, it's about what is it, and it's not just about, you deal with a customer, whether government or private sector, and you find out what they're concerned about. Yes, you want to find out what they're concerned about. But you want to find out what is it they're trying to accomplish. And perhaps you can help guide them into what's a better, more efficient, less expensive way to accomplish it. And that you can help build in at the beginning the right kinds of people, processes, and technology to manage. And to the extent you can, and these are two of the toughest things that we have to deal with, is the ROI I mentioned earlier and also the metrics mentioned earlier. And so to some extent, although we want to get to the point we have metrics, like the Center for Internet Security has been pushing for a while, of being able to say, what is the objective measurement of our risk posture? And we want to get to that point. But we also need to at least be able to say our goals and objectives and milestones so we can tell where we're going, and we can disagree about whether that's where we ought to go. How we're going to get there and when, who's going to do it, how we're going to hold folks accountable. Embrace security and resilience is critical to mission. Try to come up with, as an organization, something that you're going to tie what you're going to do to. So when you look at some of the models for legislation, and we expect the White House any day now to come out with their position, hopefully, on the cyber legislation, and we understand it will have a very strong regulatory bent, even more so than the legislation that's on the Hill, is when you look at the idea of incentives versus regulation. The idea that before you can start regulating, my suggestion is that before you say, okay, these are the key folks who need to be regulated, very important decision. Here's the standard that ought to be applied to what they do. And you really need private sector input to help figure that out. Maybe not to the excesses of the NERC in the energy regulation in terms of the quality of something that folks come up with. You need to have the principle of independent assessments of that enterprise with recommendations for mitigation. So that fundamental concept borrowed from the financial sector, where you have independent audits against some kind of a standard that makes sense in your industry. Independent, perhaps with somebody certifying the people that are doing independent assessments, but at least the independent assessments. And the other key thing that you see in the legislation, which is mandated rather than part of a public-private partnership, but this private sector engagement is going to have to take place anyway, is that DHS will evaluate what I just talked about in the regulatory context, but that DHS will recommend protective measures, additional protective measures above and beyond what is relevant to the risk assessments and the particular standards. Well, my suggestion is, okay, if we want to get to the point that we drive enterprise security, where we're helping use folks outside the enterprise to try to drive it, some things have to happen that you can't shut down people's throats that require private sector input. So why not mandate that those processes you attempt to do it in a voluntary way? What within each sector is actually critical, these companies? They call it covered critical infrastructure in the Lieberman legislation. But have those discussions and have somebody say, you're really kidding. Secondly, what is the standard that is appropriate to those particular organizations? Just like folks within an enterprise need to say, what really makes sense for us to help inform our risk management process. Let's agree that we'll get independent folks to assess our enterprise against those standards. Get folks to voluntarily say they're going to do that. Provide the results of that assessment, and of course that would include mitigative measures, to the board of directors level folks of the company. So at least for the publicly traded companies, Sarbanes-Oxley would suggest there's sort of due diligence things you have to do if you have information that you need to mitigate. And by all means, if DHS has recommendations for any company, any sector, or whatever, of extra things they ought to do to protect themselves, for God's sake, tell them. And if they don't have those special things to recommend, don't worry about fighting over the regulation and maybe it won't be this year, maybe it'll be next year. Let's set up these systems and processes for government and private sector to work together to make those recommendations and make them at the C level so then the board and folks realize that they've been warned they should do these measures, and that creates some due diligence responsibility. So in terms of people, processes, and technology, part of, when we talk about the innovation piece, the enterprise risk management efforts of NIST, I realize it doesn't officially apply to the commercial sector, but continuous monitoring, also under NIST. Talk a little bit about situational awareness. What can technology do? I gave a speech at an FC conference in Tokyo a couple years ago. When the person introduced me, he made a joke about, well, we want to see all, know all, and control all. And I got up and said, that's exactly what we want to be able to do. And I said, we need to approach it at the enterprise level, and particularly at the sector level. We need to approach it where we are trying to identify what are our security requirements. Like when Apple created the iPod. Remember that? I know that was a long time ago, but they created the iPod. They didn't just say, what can we do? They said, what do we want to be able to do? So in terms of security for an organization, what is it we want to be able to do? And look at the financial sector. Obviously, at least publicly, hasn't done it. What do we want to be able to do to help protect the transactions, help facilitate the transactions, help reduce the cost of the transactions, help monitor and audit the transactions? What do we want to be able to do? And then you create an innovation sharing capability. What can companies do to meet it? Kind of TurboTax versus tax cut. What are the specific things that they can do? What are the specific things you do? Is it real time? Is it scanning? Is it every 20 minutes? Is it whatever? So try to raise the visibility for those who are looking for technologies. those who are in startups that are trying to figure out what can we do, what do we have to do to help drive the success of our product, or how do we differentiate ourselves. You can include all that in that kind of information sharing capability. You try to make sure those people who are going to put out RFIs or RFPs, they have visibility into what is available in the current technologies. Yeah, you may need to eventually do R&D, but trying to share information and encourage innovation and try to make that information readily available to companies and government agencies who need it. So then they have a little bit of a due diligence responsibility. Oh, if you know about this. Because right now, it's every friggin' company for themselves trying to get noticed by an agency or company or whatever, and that's always going to happen. But trying to create some visibility in a problem space, and what are the requirements, and what can we meet? Some companies are going to step up and identify requirements that the people didn't even think of. But that's the nature of innovation. And we are not encouraging innovation in the government or private sector space, in my view, in that respect. You all are well aware that the gap between the security threats and capabilities is very, very substantial. We have three-stage exploitation, the active exploitation, the stealing blueprints, creating disinformation, activities going on in our networks that folks may not even realize. Those people who don't realize they're being harmed, and they don't see it. So we had a situation when I was with government where there were some attacks, not unlike the attacks we're seeing, and they were classified attacks. And we suggested that perhaps we might want to share the signatures with the private sector so that they could protect themselves. And what I was told was, well, if we, as some of our allies had already done, the government said, well, it was really only the aerospace and defense that were affected, but our allies seemed to think it was a whole lot more people that were affected. But they said, but if we share those signatures, what's going to happen? Companies are going to protect themselves from that kind of attack. And the bad guys will realize that they protected themselves, and the bad guys will find a new way to attack them. I said, okay, let me get this straight. So you're going to let the bad guys just continue to steal our folks' blind. Because if you try to help folks protect themselves, the bad guy's going to know it and will have to go to the trouble of finding a new way to... It's like, what kind of sense does that make? I may be mistaken in my views, but I think you will conclude that I have an opinion. Malicious actors need to only find one weakness. Intrusions give outsiders the access of insiders. Boy, WikiLeaks was a real revelation, wasn't it? Didn't that really come as a surprise? Economic espionage, the online systematic theft of intellectual property that is devastating our nation. Yes, it's important to worry about a digital Pearl Harbor. But if our adversaries continue to steal us blind, they won't need a digital Pearl Harbor. We will have already lost competitively to them, and we're losing now. Theft of intellectual information, personal information, access to online accounts, and potential much more significant attacks. We would suggest that most attacks are not advanced persistent threats. There's some discussion online today about covert versus clandestine, some activities on the Hill. Most companies can be penetrated by teenagers. This stuff is really not that hard. Most companies are not anywhere near that protected. You go do your penetration testing, talk to core security or whoever, and we do penetration testing also. How many times do they fail? Almost never. And because there are no real statistics on it, the government really isn't organized in any systematic way to track these advanced persistent threats, it's really hard to tell the rate of flow of intellectual property. We have a white paper, again, it's not proprietary, there's not a product to sell, and we'll send it to you and no charge, and no one will call. The SecurityStat concept that is talking about trying to look at things holistically. The organization of layer 1, local and wide area network data privacy, the overlay of security, prevent, detect, respond, intelligence, situational awareness, event correlation inside your network and outside. And when you get to the national level threats, the kinds of things that we saw with Google and NSA and at least ostensibly the NASDAQ and NSA. So integration, the exchange of information among these layers. You can't do it on your own. No product, no system, you can do it on your own. So situational awareness is absolutely critical, and participating in partnerships and trying to demand more from these information sharing partners. If I hear one more time, they're really well-intentioned people, and there was a report that a bunch of people sent to the Hill, how successful the ISACs are. They're great folks, they mean well, The conference calls when something's happening are very valuable, but in terms of the real exchange of real data, we are not advancing the ball. And to protect ourselves, to help our bosses know and help us to identify and prove to them that we are victims or potential victims of this, we need to participate in this kind of sharing. Understand what normal is, the benchmark and the baseline, the anomaly detection, the flow analysis, behavioral analysis, all those things are necessary in addition to your standard signature-based intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. Know what your threats are and make sure you disseminate the information in a way that lets your organizations. You got different kinds of consoles, you got siloed approach within most organizations, and so what we've been doing is creating a global SOC. Somebody asked about CSC. So we have 7 different centers and we're combining the information from all over the world to try to create a picture so you can learn from one. We're part of the ITISEC, we're part of cross-sector cyber group, part of the Defense Industrial Base Information Assurance Initiative. The MSTAT companies are doing a pilot that we help fund. Trying to get access to the information to protect ourselves, and frankly on the public policy front, trying to get Congress to help mandate that they expand programs like the Defense Industrial Base Initiative so real information is shared with real companies in time to do something to help folks protect themselves or find out that they've been affected. So trying to see less and understand more. Your